大家好，欢迎大家参加我们今天的讲座。我是投币得的创办人张宁，十分荣幸我们今天能够邀请到 CABI A&B 的执行主编 Philippa Benson 博士和我们一起举办这次讲座。这次系列讲座一共有5次，今天是最后一次，是 Peer Review Week 的一部分。今天是同行评议 Peer Review Week，也就是同行评议周，是每年一次的全球活动。目的是在宣传同行评议在保持科学质量方面发挥的重要作用。今年的主题是信任同行评议。首先，我们要由Benson 博士为我们做报告，然后投币得的培训部负责人 Gary Stark 博士和我们进行互动交流，最后大家可以提问题。Okay, I will repeat in English. Welcome to the last webinar in our series of peer review week webinars organized by TopEdit Author Services. My name is Ning Zhang, the founder and the CEO of TopEdit. Our webinar series comprises 5 events, all parts of our contribution to Global Peer Review Week events. The theme of this year is Trust in Peer Review. Our guest speaker is Dr. Philippa Benson. She will give a presentation in a moment, and then we will have time for discussion, Q&A at the end. Feel free to ask any questions throughout this webinar by typing them into the chat box. CABI AB 也就是CABI Agriculture and Bioscience 是 CABI 的官方期刊。CABI 是一个国际性的政府间非营利组织机构，通过提供信息和运用科学知识来解决农业问题，并最终改善全球人民的生活和环境。CABI 及其期刊致力于鼓励包容性的科学讨论文化和全球研究人员之间的快速信息分享。CABI Agriculture and Bioscience is the official journal of CABI, an international, intergovernmental, not-for-profit organization that improves people's lives worldwide by providing information and applying scientific expertise to solve problems in agriculture and the environment. CABI and its journal are committed to encouraging an inclusive culture of scientific discussion and rapid information sharing among researchers worldwide. Philippa Benson 博士毕业于卡耐基梅隆大学，博士期间他研究母语为英语和非母语的英语读写者的认知过程，重点是成年人如何创建和修改科学和技术文本。目前他是 CABI A&B 期刊的执行主编，同时他还领导 PGB 全球咨询公司，该公司为参与科技出版的众多国际客户提供咨询服务。在此之前，他是著名期刊 Science Advance 期刊的发起人和执行主编。他经常在顶尖的大学和研究中心举行讲座，内容涉及有效的技术交流和科学出版。在过去的25年中，他在卡耐基梅隆大学、乔治敦大学、匹兹堡大学、美国国立卫生研究院和联合国等机构开发和教授了大量科学写作和技术交流课程。Philippa Benson received her PhD in Carnegie Mellon University, where she studied the cognitive process of reading and writing by both native and non-native speakers of English, with a focus on how adults create and revise scientific and technical texts. Currently, she is working with CABI Agriculture and Bioscience, a new multidisciplinary open access journal. She also leads PGB Global Consulting, a firm supporting a diverse portfolio of international clients involved in STM publishing. Prior to his current work, she was the launch and the managing editor of Science Advances, the open access expansion of Science magazine. She regularly traveled internationally, lecturing at the top universities and research centers about effective technical communication and scientific publishing. Over the past 25 years, she has developed and taught a wide area of courses in science writing and technical communication at institutions including Carnegie Mellon, Georgetown University, University of Pittsburgh, the National Institute of Health, and the United Nations. Today, she will give us a talk, changing perspective on success in publishing science, understanding what editor wants in 2020. Let's welcome Philippa.
Okay, am I on now?
Yes, I can hear you.
All right. Okay. Hi, everybody. It's strange to be talking with no audience. I generally, that I can see, I generally enjoy speaking to people in person, but I'm not with you, so virtual is the next best thing. Thank you very much, Ning, for that welcome and introduction. And my talk today is really for the purpose of trying to encourage people to think about their academic success and their success in publishing in perhaps some different ways. So I'm just going to dive right into this, and please send your questions along the way, and Gareth will take note of them, and then I'll address them, and I'm happy to continue conversation when I'm done with my talk. So the first thing that I really want to do is begin by giving a very broad view of the success cycle to encourage you to keep this in mind as we're talking about these things, because as you do your research, there are many different phases to it, all of which you have to be successful in, and you, in particular, you have to be a successful communicator. So within your institution, you have to deal with department chairs and colleagues and other people who influence how you actually do your research. You then have to write up the research with your colleagues, bearing in mind their concerns and priorities. You switch views when you begin to actually think about where you're going to publish, and you start to think about the journal and the publisher as your audience and as you're interacting. When that manuscript gets into review, then you have to deal with your community as researchers and reviewers and readers. Then that research goes out into the community and is discussed and debated, and one hopes leads to new knowledge, new ideas, and then new feedback. So can people mute themselves? And then we'll go on to pose new questions, you get new funding, and the cycle starts again. So in order to be successful, the ideas that you put out have to be vetted by the community, and vetted means is really reviewed and approved to be valued and keep this cycle of knowledge moving forward. So the part of the process that authors are often focused on in terms of success is getting that paper, that manuscript in for publication, getting it through, and getting it published. And I just want to encourage all of you to be thinking more in terms of this entire cycle rather than just the part of succeeding in getting it published somewhere. So generally speaking, when authors are talking about success in publishing, this is the end point of success. Getting that letter that says, we're pleased to inform you that your manuscript has been accepted for publication. And that's kind of the benchmark of success. And I'm going to try and roll back and think and talk about where you began that process. So when you're considering where you are going to publish. So it's done and you're thinking about what that target journal is. So many times, particularly in China, the kind of gold standard is getting into a high impact journal. And one of the first things I want to do is talk about the wisdom of shooting for and choosing a target journal and a measure of success by looking at impact factor. So, you know, if you get into one of those journals, your prominence goes up and you have a little chunk of gold in your hand. However, I want to remind you that when you do that, when you take the time and effort to apply, to submit to a very top journal, you are facing an incredibly high probability of rejection. So you have not spent your time well, nor have you spent the time of the journal editors well. And one of the things I'm going to be doing a little later on is changing your perspective of this process to look at things from the editor's point of view, which I hope will be helpful. So although getting into a very top journal is a big chunk of gold, you also have an incredibly high probability of rejection. And that is not a good use of your time or other people's time. Then thinking about impact factor at all is, even if you get to you apply to a top journal, maybe not the very top, but you've still got an 80+% probability of rejection. It depends, of course, which journal you're applying to, but for example, with Science Advances, the journal that I launched for AAAS, they actually had that kind of bar that they were not going to take any more than a certain percentage, and that's the way that the journal was managed. Now, when you're talking about Mama Hoo Hoo journals, it varies. You know, what is a Mama Hoo Hoo journal, what the percentage is. It's different for journals with lower impact factor, but I'm still talking about you're thinking about impact factor at all as a good starting point for selecting the journal that you want to submit to. And I believe that impact factors are not a good measure. So journals need to, just a few details, journals need to have published for 3 years to get an impact factor. So there can be very good journals like the one I'm working on now, CABI Agriculture and Bioscience, which can and is publishing spectacular work, but it's not even going to get an impact factor until it's been publishing for 3 years because of the nature of the way that impact factors are calculated. Also, impact factors differ greatly by the type of journal that is being ranked, a multidisciplinary versus a subject-specific journal. Impact factors are driven by a very old formula, which is non-digital and not as relevant in an age when digital measures like altmetrics can be used. And I don't go into that at all, but there could be a lot of other things we could talk about different ways that science can be evaluated and measured in terms of the impact that it's having on the community who are interested in the work being done. And there are lots of other details, but the bottom line is that impact factors are really quite outdated. And as science is communicated more digitally and there are more tools, looking at impact factors as a measure of success becomes less and less relevant in many ways. So, is impact factor a good starting point? No, it's not. Impact factors are not a good starting point. And in fact, it's a bad starting point. You should be thinking about other measures to select a journal for your manuscript and for being successful in disseminating the science you've done. So there are a lot of good journals out there, and having a realistic shot for getting in is still difficult. And I'm going to go into that in a little more detail from specifically an editor's point of view. So your view of success in publication, as I said before, is that your paper gets accepted, you're published, and that's great. But now I'm going to start to talk about the editor's point of view, and this is the change in perspective that we've been talking about. So when the editor gets manuscripts in, they have to make decisions about which ones are worth the investment of their time and their energy and reviewers' time and reviewers' energy. So this is a little screenshot here from one of the peer review systems or manuscript processing systems that is used by many, many different journals. So Editorial Manager is one of them. And when the editor comes into work every day, he or she will see new submissions that have come in, transferred submissions, and revised submissions. So that editor on that day has to deal with 81 new submissions and 33 revised submissions. Now, this is a pretty high volume journal, but each one of those has to be dealt with in a specific way. So that editor is thinking, which of these are my chunk of gold for my journal, and which really aren't worth my time and energy for my journal. So what is the editor thinking of when they get, in particular, those new submissions? What is going to drive them to separate the ones that are worth the time and effort and are not? So every journal is different, regardless of the impact factor. They have different aims and scope. They have different standards for rigor and novelty. They have different article types. They have different word counts. They have different requirements. And this is incredibly important and warrants a lot more discussion specifically about data deposition, about authorship, about conflicts of interest. And there are a lot of other requirements that journals are putting into place that will have an impact on whether or not they take a paper. You may or may not know, with on the most basic level that many of the more well-established journals are going to be requiring author ORCID IDs for every single author of a paper. So if an author cannot submit an ORCID ID, that may become a problem for submitting a particular paper to a particular journal. Journals are different in terms of their review processes. They can be very, very different. Their copyright and license specifics. And again, the ORCID IDs, funder IDs, and other aspects are different journal to journal. So when you are looking to select a paper, a journal for your paper, you need to very thoroughly look and study the differences, the specific differences, way beyond just the impact factor. And along with every journal being different, every editor is different, and every editorial board is different. So the editors are looking for, when they're evaluating those new submissions coming in, they're measuring it, they're judging it related to the scope of the journal itself. So you can have a journal that really only wants the highest, big, broadest impact sorts of science coming in. So let's, for example, take a journal like Science or Nature, where they want the newest, the most broadly impactful work. So if there is something that has been relatively recently published and it's an extension of a new finding or a deepening of a new finding, but the finding isn't absolutely new, they're going to say, nope, that's already done. If they've recently published on that topic, it again doesn't fit that requirement for newness and timeliness. If a manuscript comes in and it doesn't have, and I'll talk about this a little later, even the right formatting or the right technical requirements, they're going to send it back to the author. And also, they will have a bad impression of the author if those details aren't taken seriously by that author. If papers are badly written and have lots of errors in them, that can be a turn off to some editors. Now, I do want to stop here and say, if there is brilliant new science that clearly fits the scope of the journal, and the English isn't perfect, the English is kind of bumpy, editors are going to work with those authors to improve the English. An editor will not let a brilliant paper go because of bad English. But if there is a paper that they're considering next to another paper that is also very strong, and one has very good English and the other has very poor English, then that can make a difference. If the tables and figures and other visual aspects, the data sets are not good, that's going to notch the weighing of that paper down in the editor's mind. If the citations are bad or incomplete, if there is, of course, if there is any plagiarism found, boom, that paper goes out the window. If there are issues with anything related to ethical requirements, authorship, data deposition, standards for the field and for the journal, if there are problems with licensing, if there are other kinds of things like that, the editors will, those will go on to the scale of what that editor will do next. And every editor is different. So this is one of the things that I truly feel authors need to bear in mind, that journals are run by human beings, and that those human beings have specific characteristics to them that will influence and do influence what an editor will do with a specific paper. In many journals, the more experienced authors actually develop working relationships with editors and will pick up the phone or write an email and say, hey, Jane, we're working on a paper on X, Y, and Z, and I'm thinking about submitting it to your journal. What do you think? Now, we can go into things like that later if you're interested in discussing it. All right, so what I'm going to do now is go in and talk about some of these topics in a little bit more detail related to the journal that I'm running at this time, to sort of give it some detail. You're going to have to hold on 1 second, because I'm working from home and somebody's mowing the lawn outside. So I'm going to close the door. Sorry about that. Don't want any noise in the background. So I'm going to go into a deep dive on CABI Agriculture and Bioscience, which is a new journal. So CABI Agriculture and Bioscience has a very specific scope. And if you read the scope and aim statement of any journal that you're considering submitting to, you'll find that they're really quite different if you look at them in details. And certainly the editors are thinking about the scope when they're looking at new submissions. So CABI Agriculture and Bioscience was created because of what is going on in the fields of agriculture, environmental sustainability, and general biosciences that underlie global food security, essentially. So it specifically states that it wants it welcomes science in primary related fields like horticulture and plant pathology, animal sciences and health, climate, things like that. But also that it welcomes papers that are deeply cross-disciplinary, things like the use of biomaterials to advance freshness in harvested fruit using big data sets. So there you have a number of different complicated kinds of expertise that have gone into the research, and there aren't a lot of places where an author can be sure that the journal philosophically and in terms of the review expertise wants papers that have that kind of complexity to it. It also will accept both large advances and also smaller, more local advances. If you look at journals like Science Advances or Nature Communications, for example, or even some of the journals of, for example, the Ecological Society of America, they really want those big steps in science that have broad implications. But where do you publish science that is very good science and complex science, but is just local? So one of the reasons, again, that CABI started CABI, we call it CABI A and B, for agriculture and bioscience is to provide a home for that kind of smaller research, which is very good and very important, but isn't necessarily a big step forward. It is an important incremental step forward. We could talk about this aspect of scope across many different journals. What do journals in the PLOS family take and want in the Frontiers family of journals? The scopes there are very different. And as you are selecting, considering journals to submit to, you really need to look at those. So CABI A&B also only accepts certain article types: original research, reviews, commentaries, data notes, protocols, and editorials. But it doesn't take rapid communications. It doesn't have certain other kinds of journal article types that some other journals may have. CABI A&B is also led by active top-tier international researchers. They do not have a staff of editors who deal with the first parts of the review process. I'll go over that in a bit more detail in a minute, but you should look at the editorial boards of the manuscripts that you're considering, of the journals that you're considering, because the structure of the editorial boards can have a really big impact on the course of your paper. CABI A&B also has very high standards for the research that is that they're willing to publish, and for the ethical conduct of the research itself. There are many journals who really don't look deeply into the rigor of the science that they're publishing. All right, so they also maintain a standard for themselves of fast and fair peer review. Because it is published by a not-for-profit group, they offer very generous discounts on APCs, or the article processing charges, which are necessary for open access journals. And the infrastructure of the journal is BMC, which is a division of Springer Nature. So once they publish an article, it really gets broadly disseminated through the support of BMC, as well as the organization CABI itself. Again, as I mentioned before, the makeup of an editorial board is incredibly important. All the editors of CABI Agriculture and Bioscience are active, prominent researchers. They have, some of them are in primary disciplines with multidisciplinary interests, and others focus specifically on multidisciplinary kinds of studies, like the one I mentioned before. Very purposefully, this board is diverse in the age of the editors. So we have rock stars, very prominent, well-established scientists, as well as rising stars, people who are in the academy, who are beginning the strong trajectory of their careers. So they are high-level experts, but they're younger. We also strive to balance both men and women, and the journal is looking to purposefully bring in global perspectives. So we have a regional leadership board with people from their regional editors-in-chief from South America, China, India, North America, and Africa. So these are bringing in the regional global concerns of the science we're evaluating. And all our editors are unpaid. They're doing this because they're committed to the mission of the journal. Now, if you look at some other journals, they have paid editors. They may have editors who have PhDs in certain areas, but they've been out of the lab or out of the field for many, many years. Now, this doesn't mean that they're not brilliant and informed. It just means the perspective of those editors is somewhat different than people who are active in the field and dealing with the problems of researchers day to day. So when you're looking at journals, look at the editorial board, look at the structure, look at who's on it, just so you're familiar with it, because every journal is different and every journal is managed differently. So another aspect of CABI A and B is that it's affiliated with a preprint server called Aggregarchive. There are preprint servers are a topic that we can talk about at great length if you'd like to, but it shows that the organization really wants to foster open science and open review. So it supports the idea of having open discussion and at no cost. So it's free to submit. The authors retain the copyright. It's posted almost immediately. There's no peer review involved. And the content is indexed. So these are just the fact that the journal is affiliated with a preprint server is something of note. All right, so now I'm going to quickly go through the editor's view of a publication process and talk about a couple of things that, again, to change your perspective on what things hang editors up or hang your process up as it's going through this submission process. So the first thing, when a paper comes in, it often does not first go to an editor. It goes to a staff person who checks it to make sure that often at this stage, plagiarism checks are run. They do screening of figures to make sure that they're authentic and sized correctly and things like that. They make sure that all the authors have registered properly. The smoother your and more complete your submission is, the more quickly it will go through that initial technical check. With now, depending on the journal, your submission will either go to the editor-in-chief or to a section editor. And it, again, depends on the particular makeup of the journal and workflow of the journal. This workflow is common. At that point, both of those single people can have the option of desk rejecting. And they would desk reject. The primary reason that papers are desk rejected is because they haven't shown the editor that the topic of the paper suits the scope and the aims of the journal. Those journals that have those very, very high rejection rates, that authors have not been successful in convincing the editors that their paper meets the scope of the journal. So they can desk reject it. If the editor either sees that it's a great paper or doesn't feel that he or she knows quite enough about what's current in that particular field, they will pass it on to an associate editor. And the associate editor gets to make the judgment. So it's really important when you have a multi-tiered journal that you not just look at the big primary editors, and they're given different names in different journals. Sometimes they're deputy editors, sometimes they're section editors, sometimes they're, you know, given other names. But that next tier, editorial tier, is also an important one to be familiar with. And those editors are often the ones that decide whether a paper is desk rejected or goes on to peer review. So these editors, the associate editors, are often the ones that do the selecting of what gets through that first bar. So it is that individual's sort of taste and assessment that you've got to get through. The associate editor, if they decide to pass a paper on to peer review, then has to go and select reviewers. Many journals are now allowing authors to suggest reviewers, and the associate editors look very carefully on what those suggestions are. So if an author suggests a big name person in the field, someone very, very famous, with whom they have never collaborated, that will say something to the associate editor, saying this person is just throwing out a name, as opposed to an author saying, I suggest X, Y, and Z person as potential reviewers for my paper because they did related work to mine. That tells the associate editor that the author really knows the field and is making a very informed recommendation. So the editors select the reviewers, they wait until they come in. Good journals usually require at least 2 reviews to come in. This is a place where timing gets held up. If you, as a researcher, are asked to review a paper by an associate editor and you do it quickly and thoroughly, those associate editors will remember you. Oh, that person did an incredibly good review of a paper. So when you submit your own work, those editors will have a good impression of you. So learning how to be a good reviewer and doing thorough reviews, thoughtful reviews quickly is a big part of success, because there is, again, this loop that the people who are the decision makers, the editors, see you not only through the lens of being an author, but importantly to them, the lens of being a reviewer. So after the reviews are in, then the editor can make a decision. They can reject the paper, they can send it out to revision, or they can accept it, but this usually happens after at least 1 revision. Remember that when a paper comes back from revision, usually it goes through another technical check. Now, I know from my experience at many journals, Science Advances, CABI A&E, other journals I work with, I have gotten a lot of communication and problem solving with staff at these revision technical checks. And it can be very problematic to editors and editorial staff at this point. If author paperwork isn't complete, if there are, this is many times where data sharing requirements are found out and checked. So if you are publishing in a good journal, increasingly there are requirements that you put your data in an open repository. And if you haven't put all of those things in place, it can be really problematic to editors, and they still have the option of rejecting your paper. So you should think about these things beforehand. This cycle of going out for revision and coming back can happen 1, 2, 3 times. You want to make sure that you're making that process as smooth as possible for the editor. So once you've gotten through that, one hopes your paper gets accepted and you go into the production workflow. After you get your galley, you still have things that you can do that can be problematic for editors. If you want to make major changes, if you have the wrong figure, if you want to do something like change authorship or change institution for anybody on the paper. We have had authors who bring up these topics at the very last minute, which is highly problematic for editors. And you may get the problem solved for that paper, but if you want to submit to that journal again, you're going to have kind of a little mark in the memory of the editor. So here I have really tried to change your perspective on how an editor sees this process and how they're looking at manuscripts and what you can do to make this process go more smoothly. Again, I want to emphasize that up here, in this initial decision making, the editors are thinking about the scope of the work and the match with the journal at that time. So remember, because editors are individual human beings with individual preferences and about what they think the hot science is, you should, when you're selecting a journal, you should be reading the last several months at least of that journal to see what the editors are feeling is important and are pushing forward as advances in science, to make sure that you're aligning with that journal at that time. Again, editors change over time, journals change over time. So what a journal and an editor was interested in 2 years ago or 3 years ago may not be the same thing as an editor is interested in now. Of course, the science changes, but also the decision and choices that editors are making change as well. So that's that. I do want to draw your attention to one other thing, which is incredibly important for researchers to be aware about. And this is the effort to make science more open and more reproducible. So for those of you who are not familiar with the Center for Open Science or any of the global science, open science initiatives, I strongly encourage you to visit the Center for Open Science and to look at, in detail, the guidelines for transparency and reproducibility. So they're called top guidelines for transparency and openness promotion. Some of these are aspirational and are not in place in every journal, but within a decade, many journals, if not most, are going to be moving towards enforcing these guidelines so that every study that is published is supported by open, accessible data and has done everything possible to ensure that the research that was done, the empirical work that was done, is reproducible. Because right now, a lot of science that is published is not as reproducible as funders would like, and the scientific community would like. So these are the standards that are being put in place. I've provided the DOI of the article that actually kind of publicly launched this initiative. But this topic of open science could be the topic of many lectures and is, but I strongly encourage all of you to go and look at the top guidelines, go to the Center for Open Science, and become familiar with these guidelines, because particularly for younger researchers, you will be required in the course of your career to make your data openly available, to make any code you use openly available, to make sure that the materials that you've used in your studies are available whenever processed, that your design and analysis of your research is vetted or reviewed and approved before you even start your research. For studies, particularly in biomedicine, you'll need to pre-register them, and that will go through a vetting process, and pre-register your plans to analyze the data. Again, please go to the Center for Open Science. Please look at the top requirements and think about them as you're planning your future studies. So I leave you with some top tips that I hope will help each of you have success in quickly and smoothly submitting good research to an appropriate journal and getting it through that journal quickly and without any hangups along the way. So you need to ask yourself, what is really publishable and new in my field now? Is what I am trying to publish adding to the body of knowledge? And if so, how? And make sure that you can articulate that really clearly. You need to look at which is the appropriate journal and format for your research. Maybe you want a short communication or a short research report. Maybe you want to put in a full-blown research article. Maybe you want to do just a rapid communication. Different journals have different formats, and you need to do some of the things that I've talked about earlier to make sure that you're using your time and the editor's time efficiently. You need to think about if there's a time factor involved. Do you need to publish quickly? That should and may influence the journal that you select, and it also may influence whether you decide to put something on a preprint server, which is a new venue. You need to look at those characteristics, those very specific details of the target journal that you want, the requirements for authorship, data sharing, reproducibility, conflict of interest statements, things like that. Basically, these questions are encouraging you to study the journal carefully before you decide to submit. Issues of authorship can be highly problematic, so you should decide early on who's an author and the order of authorship and who will be dealing with answering review questions. In other words, who's the corresponding author. You should write your cover letter very, very carefully. That's the completely different subject that we could talk about. But you should think about what should go into that cover letter to try and convince those early editors that your paper is a good fit for that journal at that time. You should think about any trends in scientific publishing that might impact your submission, particularly ones related to open science. You should be aware of the peer review process that your journal uses, the target journal uses, and how you're going to manage responding to decision letters. These questions, if you address these before you submit, you will, I believe, have a smoother going and get to a point of success, your own measure of success, more quickly. So just encouraging you in these crazy days that are very complex to keep some balance in your life and to remember that success in publishing is not the only thing. And I'm going to end there and I will take questions.
Thank you, Philippa. It's a very great talk. So, okay, I will encourage Chinese audience. I will let them ask some questions. So you can check the chat box. So there are already many questions there. So you can, yeah, Gareth, you can take over.
Hi, that was really awesome. Thank you so much. We love that. And our audience is listening from China and colleagues also from other parts of the world, Kazakhstan, Brazil, Spain, Portugal today also. So lots of people. Yeah, and I particularly loved your comment that journals are run by human beings, because that's so relevant, isn't it? Like
it is. It is.
But lots of people don't realize that. They're afraid of interacting with editors, especially young researchers. So do you want to comment on that?
Yes, for sure. I mean, that is something I think that is incredibly important for young, in particular, younger researchers, but all researchers to bear in mind that the editors are human beings, and most editors, virtually all editors that I've interacted with in my professional life, really want to help authors. They want to help authors succeed. They want to make their journals better. So sending in a polite, concise query to an editor is an absolutely fine thing to do. And also, again, going back to the point that I was making about editorial boards that have staff editors, for example, like Nature Communications, versus editorial boards like CABI A&B or Science Advances, where you've got active academic researchers. If someone is in your field and happens to be on a board, you can contact them in their academic seat, and don't waste their time. But if you have a real question, ask them a real academic question. And that is, again, if you go back to that cycle of knowledge, that is the author participating in the community. So, and another point I want to make here, because many members of our audience are non-native speakers of English. The vast majority of editors appreciate good thinking and good questions. Whether they're presented in a perfect grammatical form or not is absolutely secondary to the quality of the thought behind it. Yeah. So a lot of authors are hesitant and insecure because they don't have really what they feel is really, really solid English language skills. Right. But being functionally communicative is so much more important. So I myself speak really bad Chinese, but I find that my Chinese colleagues appreciate the effort that I'm making, and they understand the intention of my questions, right? And they appreciate that, and they forgive my bad Chinese. And that's the same way that editors feel. If it's a good, sound thought and a solid, interesting question, if there are grammatical problems, they'll work through it.
It is such an important message. Don't be afraid to write to editors, and don't wait. Like I have this question again this afternoon, like this evening, like it's, and we've had this question a few times this week, like how long to wait if my paper's in the system and I don't have reviews back yet? Like what would you recommend? Like,
well, I mean, one thing is there is truly reviewer fatigue. Yeah. There's, you know, for good journals, the editors want to pick good, reputable reviewers to assess work. So those reviewers, those good researchers out there who serve as reviewers are bombarded with requests, and they have their own work to do and are trying to do good work. So part of my response to that is certainly go in and ask. And I would say the way that peer review systems are set up is that reviewers get automatic reminders from the system. Every journal is set up a little bit different, but usually reviewers get like 1 to 3 days before a review is due, they get an automatic reminder. And then 1 or 2 days after it's due, and if it's not submitted, they get another reminder. And usually then 5 days after a due date, they get another automatic reminder. And then the journal staff steps in and starts saying, or the editor may step in and say, hey, Jane, you promised you'd do this review. Where is it? But also there are things where editors have reached out to 5, 10, 15 people and can't get someone to do a review. So I think the thing for authors to remember in cases where they're not getting feedback, they know that something has gone to review, but then they don't hear what it is. Bear in mind that the journal is monitoring these things. Absolutely, journals monitor this. Number two, the situation, and this is something that journal editors talk about all the time, is reviewer fatigue. That reviewers just are overwhelmed and can only do so much. So as a result of that, authors should be really mindful and thoughtful. Perhaps in their cover letters, some systems are set up with specific things in the submission system where an author can put in names. Put in really good names for people that you think will do a good, thorough job of reviewing your manuscript. Do not put in your friends and your colleagues or your co-authors or previous colleagues. Journals have ways of finding out about that. And if they find you've done that, you will get a black mark on your record. So don't do that. But do submit ones. And the other thing is, when you learn how to be a good reviewer.
Yeah. Right.
And that is an incredibly important part of succeeding in your career.
It's
Being a good reviewer is a critical part of that.
Transferable skill too. I mean,
yes.
When your boss asks you in the future to comment on a document, then you've got to be able to do a good. We have a question from the Chinese audience that I think I understand, so I'm going to ask it and then hand over to my colleagues. But when you're selecting a journal, could you think about explaining to us the difference between a high-level comprehensive journal like Science Advances, so a general journal that's got a high impact factor? Would that be better than a journal that is like a high-level professional journal that focuses specifically on my particular subject area? You see what I mean?
So I really think my philosophy about this is, who needs to know that science? Right. How is it going to be read and digested and debated? So if you go back to that cycle of knowledge, so you can have broad multidisciplinary journals that have very high impact. Those journals also have very high rejection rates.
Right.
And also they tend to publish a little bit more bulk, right? So every issue, they publish a lot. So think about Science Advances or Nature Communication, or even PLOS, PLOS One. There's a lot. So when authors work as readers, they're kind of siphoning through all the stuff that's come out of that journal in that field, that it's slightly related. Whereas if you go to a more discipline-specific journal, you're going to have a more targeted audience. And your new ideas will get into circulation and be debated and vetted more quickly. So this is where I think the measure of success is, how much does your contribution move forward human knowledge? And you can think about it in that way. I don't know, Gareth, does that answer the question? Ning, do you think that answers the question?
I think yes.
So, I mean, I think you really need to think about the readers of the journal as being...
You finish a piece of research and you're trying to decide where to publish it. Like, I could imagine that there would be some cases like where it would be better for your career and better for the reach of the paper that you publish it in a specific journal that's a technical professional journal for your field, like medical disciplines, rather than in Nature or Science.
Right. So, and again, the flagship journals of those big super high impact, 90 to 96% rejection rate, and they also have a lot of restrictions. So a research paper in Science, for example, has, I think, 4,000 words. It's a pretty short paper. Only a very, very few give the author enough bandwidth to really lay out their entire scientific argument. So those are the kinds of things when you're selecting, when you say, what's the format requirements? What are the article types? Those really matter. Like, when you've done research and you want to put it into that cycle of knowledge, of new knowledge, how much do you want to lay out for people to be able to scrutinize and chew on and debate? If it's a really tiny, restricted format, that's not going to give you the kind of bandwidth that you might want.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I have some question from China. One is which one is better? Should I direct submission or submission or I mean send a letter to editor-in-chief before submission? So which one is
so you need to look at a journal carefully to see if they even take pre-submission inquiries. So if you're trying to figure out if your paper is appropriate for the journal, look and see if the journal accepts pre-submission inquiries. If it does not, then submit, but think really carefully and write your cover letter very carefully. The cover letter, many editors read cover letters carefully. Some do not. Some just pick up the manuscript, read the manuscript, and make a decision without reading the cover letter. So every editor is different, but every author should assume that their cover letter will be read. And that is the place where the format is more open and kind of the voice that you can use can be one-on-one. So you sort of are talking to that specific editor.
OK， 大概的意思就是有的期刊鼓励是 pre-submission， 如果他不鼓励的话，你最好把那个 cover letter 写得比较好。这个我在国外都有 cover letter 这个习惯，就是无论找工作还是投文章都有 cover letter， 但是在中国好像没有这个习惯，还是所以对 cover letter 不是特别理解为什么要写 cover letter， 尤其是我在早期的时候也是有这个感觉，就是为什么要写 cover letter？ 当然大家都知道了，现在就是 cover letter 是一个比较重要的。Okay, another question is for some small discipline, so you understand what I mean small?
Yeah.
So will the journal worry about their citation and because of it's from small discipline, so the citation will not be high if they publish it?
Again, you need to look at the scope of the journal. So for example, CABI Agriculture and Bioscience philosophically wants to create a place where small advances in science that might only get a few citations, it might only be relevant. So let's think about a particular bug in a particular place that is destroying a particular crop. That piece of science is not going to have worldwide ramifications, but it's good and important science. Finding a place that where readers can be sure that it's good science, that it was rigorously reviewed, is difficult. It might go into like a pest management, journal that would take a long time to publish, or maybe also wasn't open access, so it couldn't be distributed to the parts of the world that needed it. So a journal like CABI A&B is philosophically created to take large and small advances. There are other journals, let's say a pest management journal of some sort that really only wants like huge advances that are going to have worldwide implications, for example, the use of some sort of pesticide to deal with that pest or something like that. So you, again, every journal is different. And what the authors need to do is study the journal carefully, read the instructions to authors. I mean, this is one thing that, you know, when I go to meetings with science editors, and there are lots of global meetings where science editors get together, and we'll kind of sit over a beer and say, why don't authors read the instructions? Because they come and spend a lot of time asking questions when the answers are right there in the instructions for authors. Mm-hmm. So in a particular field, if you're in water resources or genetics or pest management, look at the family of journals that you read from and become familiar with them. You know, in your free time, sit down, maybe in a journal club or something like that, and really study the instructions to authors and learn the nuances or the small variations between these journals, so that when you do a particular piece of research, you're more familiar with the landscape, and you have a better sense of what's an appropriate journal for your work.
Okay, I will translate in Chinese. So, Philippa 的意思就是你一定要仔细阅读那个期刊的 guideline，author for author guideline，就是它这个期刊是不是它的期刊的 scope， 就是它的范围。有些期刊它就是接受那种比较大的进展，有些期刊它也接受那种比较小的进展，所以是否决定主要看你的文章是否是跟这个期刊的这个scope 是不是一致。Okay.
Can I see one question here that I'd like to address?
Okay.
Can we add authors to a paper after it is accepted? No, 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 you cannot. You should not. This is why in the, you know, top tips question, you should decide on authorship early before you submit, and stick to that however possible. So I realize fully, if, for example, a paper is submitted, it gets put through review, you get comments in that say you should add a new statistical analysis, or you haven't looked at the work of Dr. X and her perspective is really important. And then you reach out to Dr. X and you invite Dr. X to participate in the revision. So you might want to add her as an author on a revision. But this is highly problematic for journals. You have to, and increasingly, good journals are not just requiring every single author to sign paperwork about ethical practices and conflicts of interest and things like that. But these are being put into the peer review, into the actual peer review system, and authors are being required to state what their contribution was.
Right. Were
they a writer? Did they do analysis? Did they, you know, wash Petri dishes? So one of the questions I had in the 10 tips was, what are the trends in scientific publishing? One of the trends is that every single author in a paper is being required to state on the record what their contribution was and how much it was. Did they do 50% of the analysis or whatever? this is part of the transparency and reproducibility effort to hold everybody accountable for their participation in the work.
Can I follow up quickly? Because I actually got a question that I wanted to, from somebody this week, like, that I wondered if I could ask your opinion on. They asked me, like, one of the reviewers gave me such good comments on my paper. Should I add, or should I invite one of the reviewers to join my article as an author? That was the question.
No, in my opinion, no. The role of the reviewer, they're taking on that task as a reviewer. I mean, I am assuming that, I don't know how that person knew who the reviewer was.
Actually, they didn't. They just said, reviewer 2 made such good comments on my work. Should I write to the journal to invite?
No, what you could do, things that can be changed at the very end after acceptance, is acknowledgments. So in a case like that, when the author deeply appreciates the input of a reviewer, they can acknowledge that person, and that can be done as a galley change in production. And they can simply put in, the authors deeply appreciate the comments and suggestions made by reviewer 2 to our article. And that's sufficient.
We've had it from the other direction too. I'm sure you have as well. But reviewers sometimes write to us and say, I feel I've worked so much on this paper that I should be added as an author. Or they even write to authors sometimes, reviewers, and say that to authors, which is not okay, right?
It is absolutely not. And that's the thing. That is, doing a good review is it's a commitment of time and intellectual prowess, but that is part of being part of this community that is dedicated to finding facts and adding to the base of human knowledge. And are you going to get credit, this big credit for it? It is difficult to get that acknowledgement, but there are technical systems and there are efforts in place for authors, for reviewers to get credit or at least acknowledgement for what they do. But as the publishing community is globally right now, reviewers just need to kind of, to be a little bit colloquial, like, suck it up. That's part of your job as being a member of the community, is to do good reviews. And you hope in turn that you will get good reviews.
Okay, awesome. I think we have time for like 1 or 2 more questions. Ning?
Oh, yes. So one question is, how can I find the proper peer reviewer for journals? I think that's a very common question. Yeah. So can you
I mean, I think that if I'm understanding the question correctly, if a journal allows you to suggest peer reviewers for your work, what you should do is go and look in your citation list. What did you build your work on? And if you had a magic wand and you could say, I wish that this person whose work I built my work on, if I knew that person and could ask them to look at this, who would that be? So I think that it should not be some big famous person that you don't know, because it has to be a realistic ask. But every journal article, every manuscript has a multitude of references. And that is the work that the new work is built upon. So that is one good place to look for for peer reviewers. Alternatively, look at the journals that you're drawing from and look at the people on their editorial board, particularly if they're academics, not desk editors, but academic editors, and then study them. So it's not just like randomly pulling people out. You actually have to do your own research into the community, the intellectual community that you're living in, and find the people who are most appropriate. I love the tent in your background.
Oh, great.
Yeah， 刚才那个简单回答就是从你的那个参考文献列表，还有那个期刊发表的文章，你想投的那个期刊的那个文章列表里面，找到那个合适的 reviewer。Okay, go ahead.
I see that there's a question about impact factors, but my supervisor wants a high impact journal. This is a cultural change that is taking place. I understand that. And that is something that younger researchers have to negotiate in their professional lives. But I also, at the same time, there's a lot of research out there that talks about the flawed nature of impact factors. And I would encourage younger researchers to go and get those papers, get those articles written often, many of them at least, by the editors of prominent journals saying that impact factors are flawed and not good measures, and just slip those onto the desk of your supervisors who grew up at a time when impact factors were the only measures of impact. And then those same researchers who are under that pressure right now to publish in high impact journals start to study the new and evolving measures of impact, altmetrics, H-indexes, other things like that. So when you become a supervisor, you have a more robust set of tools to evaluate the people that you're mentoring up. But it's an unfortunate reality now.
Okay, yeah, so it's 10:30. Yeah, it's time flies. Thank you for the great talk, Philippa.
You're welcome. And I hope all of you will, those of you particularly in the domain of agriculture and bioscience, will read and submit to CABI A and B. We don't have an impact factor, but it's a spectacularly good journal. And
CABI.org, right?
Correct. Yeah, and we call it CABI. And CABI has been around since 1910 as a research organization focused on planetary health and food security. So it's
we will promote this journal.
Great, thank you. All right, well, thank you all. It's been a lot of fun talking to you, and I welcome additional questions or queries. And certainly if anybody wants to write me about submitting to CABI A and B, feel free.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye.